This is gonna be a really good one. You're not gonna wanna miss this. Dropping straight heat here. Hey buddy, choke slam. Everybody's wanting to know this information. Everybody's trying to figure it out. I'm gonna drop everything I know to you guys right now so you can learn. This is what this channel is all about, so you better stay tuned because this is gonna be some really good stuff. And if you implement what I'm telling you and give it a try, I promise you that it will put fish in the boat. And this will be one of them things that you'll never want to put down. Even without live scope, I catch fish doing this. If the Jighead Minnow has taken off, it is so efficient and so good that to me, it is one of the most deadly techniques there is in bass fishing, hands down. So whatever you want to call it, we're going to go through all of the different techniques, you know, mid-strolling, shaking a minnow, Damiki, you know, there's different times and different ways to use them. And I think that's what a lot of people's question is. So that's what I'm here for, and that's what I'm going to break down for you guys. There's a lot of different minnows out there. I mean, anywhere from this big to this big, you know, 2 inches to 8 inches, you know, and you can use all of them. They all work in certain situations. But, you know, there's different times for all of them. I wouldn't necessarily get too wound up about the brand. I would more or less focus on size and color. Those are to me, that's the 2 main things. Now, the more advanced you get into it, you know, you got wings on them, you got different actions, you got different materials, you got this and that. But, you know, all around when it comes down to it, the main thing is the size and the color. You know, they all have their differences. They all have their similarities. So when it all comes down to it, find a brand or a color that you like, that works for you, and roll with it. It's more about finding the fish and presenting your bait right than anything to me. Now, so when it comes to the actual minnows, you've got all kinds of them. You've got 3.5 inch. You've got 4 inch. You've got 5 inch. And then you've got your bigger ones. You've got, you know, 6.5 inch. And then you've got, you know, your bigger ones, your 7 inch, and you can even go up to 8. But as you can see, there's a lot of different ones you can use, and they all have their time and their place. Your smaller baits, your 3.5s, your 4s, 3.5s, those are really good, obviously, whenever fish are targeting small bait fish. So whether it's leading up into the fall, in the winter, you know, or when the fish are really finicky to get to bite, your small ones, your 3.5, 4, 3, 2.5 inch baits, you know, really excel in those situations. Now, when you get to, you know, your 5, 5.5, 4.5 inch baits, these are really good all around profiles. You know, when you see a bait fish swimming through the water, whether it's a, you know, a threadfin, an alewife, whatever, you know, a bluegill, a lot of them are around that 5 inch range. Like, this is just an all around good bait. You know, when the water dingies up a little bit, they can still see it good. And it really just mimics majority of the bait, you know, in majority of the lakes. So this, your 5 inch, you know, high 4, 5.5 inch minnows are a really good starting point if you're just getting started. So all around, that is by far the best minnow, in my opinion, for any situation, whether it's smallmouth, spotted bass, largemouth, whatever the case may be. So as we go up, you know, you got a 6.5, you got a 6, you got a 7. And when these come in play the most are whenever the fish that you're fishing for are targeting bigger forage. So they're targeting gizzard shad, they're targeting, you know, potentially rainbow trout, you know, they're targeting big bluegill, crappie, you know, and you're fishing for big fish, you know, and not to say a little bit smaller fish. Sometimes those big spotted bass will tear up a big minnow, and so that really comes into play good. You know, it can work any time of the year depending on what lake you're in. You know, every lake's different, and the bass feed on different bait fish in every single lake. So that's something, you know, you got to pay attention to and make the decision when it comes to that. But as far as times a year, this stuff really excels when your fish are super aggressive. So like pre-spawn, you know, post-spawn, summertime, you know, when your fish are looking for a real big meal, it's really good. And it's just like a glide bait. It's got a lot of drawing power. So you may get a lot of follows, you know, and no commitments, but you know, it's got that drawing power like a glide bait. So it can work in the same situations a glide bait can. And even when the water's a little dingy, you know, this may be something to use as well, to be able to get those fish to see it. Or if, you know, you're wanting to present a bigger meal. They've got their role whenever fish are really targeting bigger forage, you're wanting them to see it, or you want some really good draw power. These excel really well. So with that being said, you know, you've got your different sizes. As far as it comes to colors, so I'm going to use any of these just as color wise, but I'm going to give, you know, different watercolor situations. So say you're fishing like Highland Reservoir, super clear water. You want something, obviously, just like anything, just like a jerkbait, top water, whatever. You want something super natural. So when it comes down to like super clear water, you know, size can vary on what bait you want to throw, but when it comes to actual color wise, you know, something like this, like a ghost minnow, you know, a gray glimmer, something that's almost translucent, you know, that they're not getting a great look at, that's not standing out really good, you know, is what you really want in that clear water. Now, potentially on some clear water situations, on like a real cloudy day or something, you may bump it up and go to something a little, you know, wider or something. But those fish are smart. They've got a lot better eyes. They can see better. So, you know, they feed off sight a lot more. So you really want to try to naturally, you know, and your bait fish may not be that color. You know, if you're fishing, you know, if they're perch color, you know, and your water's really clear, then maybe you'll go to something like this. Just depends. And this is a really good color, one like a Wagasaki type color, brown back, clear belly type color, even in clear water. So something that, you know, that's super natural. You know, this is a really natural colored bait. This is a really natural colored bait, you know. It's almost see-through on the bottom. It's got that brown back. You know, it looks like a bluegill or a perch or a bait fish in the water. So when it comes to clear water, you really want to be natural with your stuff. Now, as it gets later into the winter and your fish start, you know, getting deep and your bait fish are deep and whatnot, now potentially you could go into something like a white, just because the shad turn more of a chromish whitish, you know, as the water cools down and when they get deeper. So when it comes to clear water, you really want to match your forage and keep a natural presentation. Now you got another color situation, almost like, you know, your green tint, your little bit of stain, you know, maybe a couple foot visibility or less. Start playing with, you know, your whites, something that's got some sparkle in it, some flash, something with some color to it. Maybe your lake, it may be like a river system. It may always stay green, it may never get super clear. So, you know, something that's got a little bit of more tone to it, and, you know, it's got something that them fish are going to be able to see a little bit better, may be better for, you know, whenever your water's stained up a little bit more. But don't think that they won't see these real natural clear colors, because they will. But you got to bring your bait a little bit closer to them and make more accurate casts when you're in stained water, you know, with your clear, more translucent baits. So, you know, then you fall into potentially not presenting it as good, because you got to get your bait closer to them and you got to be more accurate. After that, you know, a minnow will even work in stained water. Like, once it gets chocolate milk, you can almost not count it out. I've caught fish on it, but it just makes it harder. And honestly, you're not very efficient with your fishing. You know, you're constantly trying to make casts. You're trying to hit them right on top of the head. So you want to kind of get away from it. Once it gets like chocolate milk, I'm talking, you know, half a foot visibility type deal, you know, dirty water. It's not the best, but it can still work. So if you're wanting to get into that realm, and it's a good way to get them to bite sometimes, if you can get them to see it, but it can be really hard to get them to see it. But if that happens, you want to key in on these whites and chartreuses when the water's super dirty, you know, only because you want those fish to see it. And this bait right here, a minnow, has no vibration hardly at all. You know, it's not making any noise. So it's super subtle. So when it comes down to it, it's all sight related. So, you know, in stained water, they got to have something to key in on. Like, you know, you drop down, you know, something like these, you know, a translucent, more of a natural color, you know, the odds of them seeing it just isn't great. So when it comes to that really stained water fishing, you want something that they can really hone in on and see and target. You know, your chartreuse and whites, your whites, and even sometimes just a chartreuse is the deal when it comes to dirty water minnowing. So you've got your different techniques. Like I said, you got your strolling, you've got like more of your Damiki type style. And those are two really different things for me, you know. When it comes to actually like strolling, shaking a minnow, you know, they're floating, you know, you're looking to stroll that bait over top of them, throw past them and stroll it over top of them. So that's where that comes from, the mid-stroll technique. You know, and there's also bottom strolling it on the bottom, keeping it right on the bottom. That's a good way to blind fish for it when you're doing it. I like to use between a 4 and 6 to 7 inch bait when it comes to that. That is your fish that are going to be higher up in the water column. I'm going to say 20-ish or less. So what that means is you're going to be using lighter heads. When your head size, you know, is key. You know, say those fish are in, you know, 10 foot or less, you don't want, you know, you don't want to make a big splash. You don't want it to fall past them real quick. You know, you want to keep it above their heads at all times. So like a 16th and an 8th for me, unless, you know, the fish are just super aggressive and the wind was potentially blowing really hard, then you could maybe bump it up to like a 3/16. But when it comes to those fish like 10 or less, 12 or less, you know, a 16th and an 8th are definitely your go-to. You know, your presentation's a lot more natural. You're not making a huge splash, and it just seems that that works a lot better. You've got to keep it above them. Very seldom will you catch a fish if it gets eye level with them or even close to eye level or below them. Very seldom will you ever get one to bite like that. So think of it as, you know, you've got your fish sitting right here, and you know, you're sitting over here, you throw your bait past them, and so you start strolling it back to you. Well, as you're doing that, you know, say your fish is sitting here, you want to keep it above them, and you want to keep it at a distance to where they can just barely see it. So, you know, visibility in the water, pay attention to that. You don't want to put it right on them if you can see 5 foot down. You want to keep it up and, you know, just slightly catch their attention and get them excited, you know, make them want to go get it. You know, if they get a real good look at it from the get-go, then they're probably, you know, I don't know about it. But if you, you know, excite them and get their attention, then your chances of get one to bite are way better. You want to throw it past them and naturally bring it to them. Don't ever let your bait fall. Don't ever bring it up high too fast. Keep it very steady. Keep it subtle. Keep that rocking action going. And, you know, as that fish starts to change its mood and you see if it acts like it's super hot on it, sometimes you can play cat and mouse, run it from them a little bit quicker, and bam, you know, cause that reaction strike. Sometimes, you know, they want it at the same pace. You know, if he just kind of slowly eases up on it, keep it at that same pace, you know, talk him into biting it. So when it comes to strolling, always remember, keep your bait above the fish, always. Don't ever change the pace of it other than speed. You can change the speed on it, but you always want to be keeping it at the same depth and above them. So on those little bit deeper fish, you know, anything above or below, anything below 12 to 15 foot, you know, you can start dabbling with that 3/16 to a 1/4 ounce when it comes to strolling. You know, that just gets your bait down a little quicker. It's more effective to fish in deeper water, but the only thing about that is it changes the action of your bait, so it's a little quicker. It's not as natural, so you really got to pay attention to keeping it above them, not letting it get below them, and you know, working it naturally coming over them, because it does hinder the action of your bait. So you just got to pay attention to that when you get heavier with the strolling. To me, this is where it goes from strolling to shaking a minnow, you know, instead of Damikian. So this is that in between strolling and Damikian, and you could call it shaking a minnow. This is your, you know, bigger heads. You know, you could start around a 1/4, you know, a 1/4, a 5/16, a 3/8. This is for your deeper fish you know, when they're in bait or, you know, pushing, moving really hard in deeper water, getting that bait to them as quick as possible. This is where, you know, you upside your head. And it is strolling and it is Damikiing, but, you know, it's more like, yeah, shaking a minnow. You know, you're throwing it to them. It's kind of a little bit of both, because in a sense, you know, you're throwing it to them, sometimes dropping it to them and bringing it over them, and sometimes you're throwing it past them and reeling it over them like you're strolling. So it's a very versatile way to shake a minnow. So yeah, when you get into your bigger sized heads, you know, if you're that's when you're fishing deeper. Maybe you got current, maybe the wind's blowing, you know, whatever the circumstance may be there, that's when you start getting into your bigger heads. Now, like I said, it'll hinder the action of your bait. So it's going to make your bait move a little faster. It's going to make it move less naturally. So you really got to pay attention to how you shake it and how you present it to those fish, because it doesn't look as natural. But when the fish are super aggressive, sometimes it doesn't matter, especially when they're blowing through bait, or they're, you know, not finicky at all. So getting into more of the Damiki style, and even, you know, up to a ½ ounce, you kind of do the shaking the minnow deal. You know, if you, like I said, if you're fishing a little deeper, you know, throwing it past them and bringing it to them, but your bait really wants to sink bad, so you got to keep it above them. And it's kind of hard to talk those fish into biting with a ½ ounce head, you know, when they're really hot on it and you got it above them, because they get even with it so quick, and it's so hard to bring your bait up after that, you know, that it wants to get below them very fast. So this is where you start getting into the more Damiki style. The Damiki style is more, you know, fish very close to your boat, fish that are very, you know, pretty deep, in that, you know, anywhere from, you know, 20, 25 to 80 foot deep, you know, super deep. So, you know, you're more dropping it to them, you know, keeping it above them, because when you're close to the boat, you can keep it above them very well. But whenever you throw it out past them, that bait wants to pendulum down when it's heavier. So keeping it above them when it's way out there is harder. So this is more like closer to the boat, you know, keeping it above them well, getting it to them very quick, because they're moving fast, they're deep, and you got to get something to them fast. So whenever you get in these situations, you know, you got a ½ ounce, a 3/4 ounce, and even up to a 1 ounce, just depending on how deep they are. You know, obviously a 1 ounce, your bait is not going to work near as good as it does on a ½ ounce. But, you know, if those fish are in 80 to, you know, 60 foot deep, you know, dead middle of the winter, sometimes you got to have that, because they're moving so quick and they're busting through baits super deep, that you got to have something that just gets to them and that they see it. So you go up to that. Now, once they're a little bit shallower, you know, 50, 40, if you know, maybe you'll go to like a 3/4. And maybe if the fish are finicky and they're even out to like 60 and 80, then you're in that 3/4 range, you know, something that you can, like I said, it's not pendulum them down as bad whenever you're bringing it back to the boat. You can keep it above them better. You can keep it, you know, more natural presentation. And then, you know, your fish above that, you know, anywhere from, you know, 30, you know, to up to 50, or even super deep, you know, you can use that ½ ounce head, and it's going to give you a more natural presentation. It's just harder to get it to them when the wind's blowing. You know, those fish are moving so fast, and when they're that deep, it takes so long to get to them. And being effective and getting something in front of their face, you know, you got to get up to those bigger, you know, 1 ounce, 3/4 ounce heads, you know. And this is majority of the time dead middle of the winter. They're in bait balls and stuff like that. So this isn't always getting used, but when it's the time, you know, that's what you got to have. And that's more of the Damiki style, close to the boat, dropping it down to them, you know, pitching it to them in bait, or maybe off some really deep points, or in a real deep creek channel or ditch or something like that. So these can be very effective whenever it's right. When it comes to actually, you know, putting, you know, your minnow on the head, like I said, it's totally preference. You know, there's all the way from a 3-inch to a 7-inch that you can be using, and smaller or bigger. But, you know, like I said, you got to pay attention to the forage that's in your lake. You got to match it the best you can, and figure out what those fish want that day. They may want a smaller one, they may want a medium-sized one, they may want a bigger one. The water may be a little dingier, so you got to use a bigger one, and water may be really clear, so you got to use a smaller one. Maybe you're wanting to get down to those fish in, you know, 60, 80 foot, but a 7-inch obviously is going to hinder the fall, you know, slow it down. But, you know, something of that really small 3 to 3.5 inch range, they're having a hard time tracking it that deep, so you got to throw that 5, you know, to get their attention, to get them to see it. All that comes down to spending time on the water and figuring out, you know, I'm here to break that down the best I can, but I can't tell you everything. So, you know, you got to take what I'm telling you and play with it yourself, and it'll start to click. You know, if you take what I'm telling you now and listen and go out and try it, it will all start to click and it will all work. You just got to get on the water and you got to see what works for you, and you got to see what works for the different situations the best. When it comes to rods are huge. So starting back to the strolling situation with the really light heads, this is what I like. A Duckett Jighead Wheeler Series 2.0 610 medium light. It's got a lot of really good whippy tip to it. It's got good backbone so you can drive into those bigger fish. You know, you can really get a good hook on these small, tiny jig heads, but at the same time, you get that limber, whippy action at the end of your rod to be able to give, you know, these smaller baits a good action. You know, on top of that, it's super light, and you're able to, you don't have to build up a bunch of power to throw your bait out there. You know, you can make quick pitches, and that's everything. You know, getting to the fish quick, making a quick throw to them. So the 610 medium light Jighead Wheeler 2.0 series from Duckett is by far my favorite, you know, strolling, lighter head situation when it comes to minnow fishing. Thing from like a 1/16 to a 1/4 ounce, you know, is awesome on this rod. As you start to get up into, you know, your little bit heavier heads, you know, you want to use something like this. Is still this one right here. This is the Duckett Micro Magic Pro medium light. And, you know, I like this one's a medium light, but it's a little bit longer, you know, so when it's windy and stuff, I can really get a good cast. And, you know, say I'm fishing in, you know, some bigger, heavier cover, you know, like timber or whatever the case may be, you know, I can pull those fish out of there a little bit better. So this is a really good all-around rod because you can also throw heavier heads on it. This, I mean, this is a straight utility rod when it comes to minnow fishing. I mean, you can throw anything from a 1/16 to, you know, 1/2 ounce or more on this thing. This is one I really like too. Another one, you know, when you get up into those, you know, 1/4 or 5/16, you know, all the way up to that 1 ounce head, Jighead Wheeler 2.0 series, awesome rod. You want to be using, you know, that medium or medium heavy rod, just because you're able to make those casts with those bigger, heavier heads. You can control them better, and that goes to say the same for like your bigger minnows, you know. So anytime your bait's, you know, fairly heavy, you know, you want to get more into that medium heavy action rod, something that can handle those baits well. So yeah, you know, you just kind of got to see, you know, what you've got going, you know, what size head, what you're going to be throwing, and then, you know, pair it up with something that can handle it well, but at the same time, you know, not hinder the action. So like if you're using something light, you don't want, you know, a stiffer rod because it's going to hinder, you know, the action of your minnow. But if, you know, you go to something a little heavier, you don't want something too light, you know, rod wise, because then, you know, you're not going to be able to control your minnow as well. So yeah, as far as it comes down to rods, these are the three that I really like. You know, you got your 610 medium light Jighead Wheeler 2.0, you got your 7-foot medium light Micro Magic, and then 7-foot medium Jighead Wheeler 2.0, all by Duckett, all sweet rods. This is what I'm throwing when it comes to shaking a minnow. When it comes to line size, almost all the time. The only time I'm not using 8-pound braid is whenever I'm like in some super thick cover or fishing for some super big fish. Then I may bump up to like 12 or 15 at the most. But 8-pound braid by far gives you the best casting distance. It makes your bait sink quicker. You know, it's 8-pound braid is super strong. You know, it comes off your reel smoother. When you're throwing in those deep depths, you know, it's coming off your reel faster so you can get to those deeper fish. You know, it gets your bait down quicker, and you know, it's just so much smoother and so much more effective when it comes to casting and fishing it. As far as the leaders go, when it goes to leaders, I like to use anything from a 6 to up to a 17-pound leader. So I'll go through those. 6, 8, 10, that's for really clear water, deeper fish. Now, when it comes to those really small minnows, like on a light head, on that 16th ounce head, I usually don't go above 10. I think it kind of messes with the action. You can go to 12. I do it sometimes if the fish are super aggressive and I'm catching a lot of them, just so it doesn't tear the, you know, my line up with their mouths. But, you know, that 10 to 6 pound is either for super clear applications or super deep applications. Then, you know, you got your 12, your 15, your 17. I kind of bump that up as I go depending on where I'm fishing and time of year. 12 is a really good all-around one. It's not too thick to where it could potentially, give you fewer bites and clear water, but it's strong enough to where you're not going to have to worry about dumb breakoffs. And then, your 15 is like really good for, heavy cover, bigger fish. I like to throw it in like schools and stuff just because you're catching them over and over and over, and your line's going to be getting tore up by their mouths. And then like 17, I use that if it's like standing timber, really big bass, just because of the break off factor. As far as leader lengths, I'm usually sticking between 1 foot and 3 foot. I don't want something very long. The less it goes through your eyes on your rod, the quicker you can get your bait out there, the less your knots getting tore up. And actually, the less leader you have out there, the better action, the more control you have over your bait, the better action it's going to give it. So yeah, that's all of it. You can take what I'm telling you in this video and take it out on the lake, and I promise you it will put more fish in the boat for you, because I cannot tell you how many bass on how many lakes I've caught with these methods, but they all have certain situations. It's all these different times of year. So you just got to go out, figure out what the fish are doing, figure what they're at, and then take what I'm telling you, and use those different sizes for different applications. So you can catch fish in all stages. Every day of the year you can catch fish out like this, unless it's just super chocolate milk or it's super shallow, and you can still catch them like that, but it just, it's not as good, which people don't really know. But I've caught them on bed doing this. I've caught them on bluegill beds doing this. I've skipped it under docks for them like this. I've caught them out of bait. I've caught them floating in their spawning areas, before they get on the bed like this. It is, you can pull them up off the bottom. You can pull them off trees. I've caught a lot of bass. I've caught some big ones this year, in the summer out of schools and stuff without scope doing it. If you got any questions, put them in the comments. Let me know. I'm very thankful, you guys. Thankful for the support. Tell everybody about this stuff. Start sharing it. Subscribe, like. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next one.